My talk tonight is entitled Struggle Heats Up in Central America, which will focus on important political events occurring in the region. I didn't formulate the title, but I think it perfectly sums up what's happening in Central America right now. The struggle in Central America that we're referring to is a class struggle, the same one that's taking place all over the world. A struggle between the rich and the poor, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. In Central America, this struggle is intensifying by the minute, like a tea kettle reaching its boiling point. It's important to mention that this struggle has taken on unique forms in the different countries in the region. Tonight, I'd like to focus on two countries in particular, Guatemala and Honduras. While there are also important political events occurring in other Central American countries, such as El Salvador and Nicaragua, I won't have enough time to get into how class struggle is playing out in those particular nations. It's worth mentioning, however, that in those two countries that I just mentioned, El Salvador and Nicaragua, the proletariat has a dominant position in the class struggle. In El Salvador, our friends and comrades of the Frente Farundo Martí para la Liberación Nacional, also known as the FMLN, hold state power and are doing amazing things for the poor. The same holds true for our compañeros of the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, known as the Sandinistas, as they also hold state power. In Guatemala and Honduras, however, things are playing out a little bit differently. If you haven't already heard, the right-wing president, Guatemalan president, Otto Pérez Molina, has been removed from power over his involvement in the corruption scandals. On Wednesday, September 2nd, we can clap it up for that. That's a good, worthy of claps. On Wednesday, September 2nd, Molina submitted his notice of resignation hours after the country's Attorney General, Claudia Paz, issued a warrant for his arrest. On Thursday, which is today, September 3rd, the Guatemalan National Congress voted 118-0 in favor of accepting his resignation, signaling the unanimity of opposition to his regime. Molina is expected to be prosecuted in coming weeks. The corruption scandals that he was involved in incorporates two major events. The first involved a multi-million-dollar customs fraud that was exposed by a UN report released this April. Guatemalan government officials were reported to have been accepting bribes in exchange for lower customs duties for private corporations. The second involved Guatemalan Social Security Institute officials who signed a $15 million contract for dialysis with a company that had no experience and no adequate medical tools in exchange for kickbacks. So they purposely signed contracts with these private medical firms in order, knowing in advance that they didn't have adequate resources in order to receive kickbacks. Molina was an accomplice to and a beneficiary of both events. In Honduras, a united front of opposition to right-wing President Juan Orlando Hernandez is being formed by members of the National Congress by the opposition parties. Hernandez, who snuck his way into power by rigging the country's 2013 presidential elections, is also involved in a corruption scandal. Last June, the left-wing political news channel Globo TV revealed that corporations linked to an embezzlement scandal involving the Honduran Social Security Institute provided funds for Hernandez's National Party during his 2013 presidential campaign. This is the same election many years after the coup d'etat in 2009 in Honduras, where Juan Orlando Hernandez and the National Party, the U.S.-backed National Party, used fake IDs. They used IDs from dead people, and they used IDs from migrants to count as voters for the right-wing party. And that they used that as a way to seemingly beat the popular left-wing Libre Party, which is the party I belong to. Private medical companies like the Mesa, based in Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras, helped finance his campaign using profits made from backroom deals with the Social Security officials. The Mesa has held a contract with the Honduran Social Security Institute since 2011. Social Security officials knowingly approved the purchase of overpriced medical equipment and low-quality machines in exchange for bribes, just like in Guatemala. So literally the same thing happened in both countries, where in Guatemala, it's called the Instituto Guatemalteco de Seguridad Social. In Honduras, it's called the Instituto Hondureño de Seguridad Social. In both situations, the Social Security Institute knowingly signed contracts with companies that literally had like 20, 30-year-old equipment, that had expired medicine, and etc., which injured and affected tons of people. Imagine going to the hospital right now and they're giving you stuff from like the 80s, you know, that's expired, and using equipment that doesn't work, and all that money is going to fund a right-wing, you know, campaign, like if it was going to Trump or something. So that's what's going on right now. In Honduras, approximately $330 million was stolen from the Social Security Institute, significant portions of which were siphoned into his campaign. Thousands of Hondurans have died and are still dying as a result of the extraction of funds originally intended for medicine equipment. I think the last time I checked it, that figure was up to 3,000, past the 3,000 mark, I believe. People who received expired medicines, insulin that wasn't sufficient, people literally dying who believed they were receiving adequate care. In Guatemala, efforts to remove Molina from the presidency have come to fruition. In Honduras, Hernandez still remains in power, but might not remain there for long as opposition continues to grow against his regime as well. Moreover, now that Molina has been pushed out, many are looking to do the same in Honduras as a sort of domino effect. And some media have called it the Central American Spring. But there's one key force of the ongoing class struggle in Central America that I haven't mentioned yet, which is the proletarian masses. It was the poor working class people of Guatemala who formed the anti-corruption movement and managed to push Molina out of office. If it weren't for the labor of the masses in protesting day in and day out, Guatemalan government officials would remain reluctant to challenge the status quo. And that actually has proven true, because the National Congress was actually hesitant to even remove immunity from Perez Molina, from him being removed from presidency. They literally had, the masses in Guatemala literally had to push their way through the doors of the Congress and urge the members to vote him out. In Honduras, it is also the poor working class people who are challenging Hernandez's right-wing regime in the form of the Movimiento de los Indignados, which in English could be translated to Movement of Indignant Peoples. As I mentioned in a Workers' World article published earlier this summer, when protests in both countries began, the mass uprisings in Honduras and Guatemala, they have to be understood as being similar in content. They're very similar. Although the corruption scandals that sparked the anti-government mobilizations involve different political figures and institutions, they both took place in countries that are so deeply entrenched in the global economic system of capitalism. The expansion of profits for private interests is so central to capitalism as it is to the corruption scandals that happen in both countries. I mean, that was the whole point. You know, these government officials purposely made deals with fraudulent medical companies, and in the case of Guatemala, made deals with other private corporations to levy taxes and to make a profit. That was the profit motive. The profits were in command in those particular situations. Both Central American nations are under the control of right-wing political parties working in favor of the global ruling economic class, which seeks the expansion of profits at the expense of millions of people, as we've already seen. The everyday super exploitation of workers and farmers leads inevitably to corruption and bribes. And as I mentioned before, it all boils down to profit. This is different from neighboring El Salvador and Nicaragua, as mentioned before, where the governments are working in favor of the poor and are empowering their own people with food, housing, healthcare, and institutions run by the people so as to avoid corruption to begin with. There are mechanisms in place in Nicaragua and El Salvador within the government where there's so much popular regulation and oversight over these institutions that these kind of corruption scandals are unknown in those countries. And actually, another big reason for that is because there has been so many media campaigns attacking the governments of Nicaragua and El Salvador that if they were to even try to do something like that, they would immediately be under the spotlight. Just as corruption in Honduras and Guatemala should be understood as being integral to the economic system of capitalism, the anti-corruption protests must also be understood as necessary mass reactions. These demonstrations in Guatemala and Honduras, they were very different from previous protests in the country. I think the movements that have been going on in both countries in recent months have actually been the protests that have had the most amount of people out in the streets. I know in the case of Honduras specifically, there were actually more people out in the streets than after the coup, which is something very interesting that we have to study. And that also tells something about the nature of just how serious this global economic collapse of capitalism is, that they have to go as far as stealing from people in the third world, from people in third world countries, stealing whatever pennies they can salvage to make their own profits, to expand profits. And again, Otto Perez Molina and Juan Orlando Hernandez are very friendly with U.S. corporations, and then we see the role that U.S. imperialism and U.S. corporations play in literally taking medicine and resources out of the hands of people in Central America. Both of these movements have been covered separately, which has really bothered me because they're so similar in content, but the media has tried to do the best it can at making them seem like completely isolated things. Another attack that I would say is coming from within the movement as well are the role of U.S. NGOs in trying to neutralize and pacify people in these countries, which is something that is very interesting. There was an article that was published in Telesur English recently that talks about it in a very, very good way, and it kind of compares the movements in Honduras and Guatemala to kind of like the Arab Spring. It draws some parallels in terms of people. There was agreements on not making it about specific political movements, making it seem like more of a national protest. This is about Hondurans and Guatemalans protesting against their government. It's not about particular parties. And after doing a lot of research, I've found that the groups that were actually promoting the depoliticization, thank you, apologize for that, and neutralization of these movements were largely NGOs based in the United States who they understood what's at stake right in Guatemala and Honduras. If the masses were to nationalize these medical institutions, all those corporations that were making money are going to lose profits. So the U.S. ruling class and the U.S. bourgeoisie wants to avoid that. They also, however, want to wash their hands clean from any connections with, dictators in Latin America. So they've very conveniently used these kind of like social democratic groups, NGOs, to try to neutralize the people and focus on smaller specific issues. I don't want to sound in any way like I'm criticizing. This isn't necessarily a criticism of the mass movement. This is just my analysis of the political direction of the movement. There haven't been calls for nationalization. There haven't been calls for complete overhaul of governments in Guatemala and Honduras. In both countries, they have been demanding what's called the Comisión Internacional, which is basically international commission set by the opposition parties to investigate what's happening and to kind of just replace, the elected officials, not only the presidents, but also the different Social Security officials involved. It is challenging because as of yet, there isn't complete calls to completely change the systems and the mechanisms that create that in the first place. But I think this shows an ounce of potential for what could happen. These were, as I mentioned before, the largest protests that have occurred in both countries. I'm talking, hundreds of thousands of people in cities all over both countries, in Tegucigalpa, Guatemala. And this was kind of a way for everyone in the country to really feel, this was an experiment in which many people really felt, like physically felt, how dangerous and how destructive capitalism is when they were given expired medicine and when their resources were taken away from them, to really feel it. So while at this moment we're not necessarily saying that we're going to see a revolution happen in Guatemala and Honduras, this was really one of the first times that something this big affected this many people. And for many people in both countries, this was the first time that they even protested, which is something very important as well. And that shows potential for the future of, we as Marxists, we understand that this is going to keep happening if the system isn't changed. So the further this continues happening, people are going to realize that it's not just specific people, it's not just Otto Perez Molina, it's not just Juan Orlando Hernandez, it's the whole system. And I think that this is the very beginning of that. So that's pretty much, all I wanted to mention. And lastly, this, just as a last point, this also relates so much to the migrant struggle, because the people from Central America, the highest migration rates are coming from Guatemala and Honduras. There aren't hundreds of Nicaraguans in Texas, going over to Texas and California, looking for food and water, because those resources are already there. Same thing with El Salvador. Salvador, like every socialist country, has its issues, but it's definitely more secure and less corrupt than Honduras and Guatemala. So that's pretty much what's going on. One day, hopefully we can imagine a united socialist Central America with Honduras and Guatemala. That would be cool. But we'll see how it goes. This has potential for that in the long run. But I think it's an important struggle to really keep up with, especially since both of these countries are literally considered the backyard of the United States. This is where the U.S. commits some of the most atrocious acts that we'll never hear about. For some of the more allied colonies of the U.S. empire to be rejecting a U.S. supported leaders is a big sign, even if they're not necessarily chanting for socialism or chanting for complete revolution. So that's pretty much it. Thank you. The questions pertaining to Guatemala and Honduras, I think one was about the potential for kind of military coup within, the role of the military within both countries in opposing the regime or siding with the people, like what's going on with that. So to end, there was that question. There was the question about NGOs, and there was one more, I believe. The narcos. There you go. Okay, so I would say in terms of the military, it's very true. Guatemala and Honduras are extremely militarized. And Honduras has the largest military in Central America, and it also receives the second amount of highest support from the United States after Colombia. Colombia is actually the highest recipient of U.S. military aid. It's very difficult because in the protests in Guatemala and Honduras, what made it very different this time compared to the coup and other movements in Guatemala is that the troops actually weren't firing on the people. The troops for the first time, were actually just on the sidelines. So they weren't necessarily on the offensive. They were just they were kind of lined up against the streets or lined up against property. They weren't firing tear gas, or they weren't like firing things at the people as they have done in when it's been, let's say, like FNRP, or in the case of Guatemala, the indigenous protest. Since these have been such mass movements within the military, there is fear that if there is, as playing out right now, actually Monica just showed me right now that the Guatemalan president was just jailed, like right now as this meeting happened. When we first began, he had just resigned, and then now he's actually been jailed. So yeah, it's really good. Things are happening.
Because of your talk.
Yeah, right. It just happened, you know. So, you know, it's hard because in those countries, a lot of the soldiers are young. They're very young people. They're working class people. And they also don't want to be on the wrong side of history for those specific countries, in the sense that, you know, if there is in Guatemala, I guess this is advancing quicker. If there is kind of a whole new government, new parties, the people who were defending Otto Pérez Molina, and in the case of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernández, they're going to remember them, and those are going to be the people are going to go after them first. So I think the militaries in both countries have kind of taken a defensive position rather than offensive. And from what I've read, there have been people, soldiers who have marched in the demonstrations, but they haven't necessarily allied themselves with the people as an institution. And let's say the way that, like, the Bolshevik Revolution, right, where you have like the soldiers allying with the people at a certain point. It hasn't gotten to that point yet, unfortunately, but that is a good sign. The fact that this is not only the largest mass movements in both countries, but also the fact that the militaries haven't taken an offensive role, which shows that they're scared of the capability of thousands of people that are coming together. The narco traffickers, 100% in terms of Guatemala and Honduras, the former president of Honduras, Porfirio Lobo Sosa, his son was just a few weeks ago was arrested by DEA agents in Miami with like a whole bunch of kilos of cocaine, and they discovered that he was a narco trafficker. Like this, imagine like the son of if Obama had a son, if like he was arrested for being a narco trafficker. So 100%, the governments of Honduras and Guatemala are completely invested in the narco trafficking industry. They know about it. They make money off of different cartels and groups passing through. That's really how, it's not necessarily that they themselves sell it, as in the specific case of the son of Porfirio Lobo Sosa. Those are some like more extreme examples, but they're aware of it and they allow it to pass through their country, whereas El Salvador and Nicaragua are very strict about it, and you never see the kind of narco trafficking issues that you see in Honduras and Guatemala. In Nicaragua and El Salvador is virtually non-existent in those countries because they have stricter regulations on narco trafficking and social programs. The last question about the NGOs, basically, so after, I guess this applies a little more to Honduras. There were NGOs that participated in Guatemala as well that basically, made it a policy to not have political flags and things like that. In Honduras, after the 2009 coup d'etat, there was a party that was formed called the Anti-Corruption Party. They're social democratic. They're the types that are like, we're neither left nor right. We're just against corruption. We're Hondurans, that kind of stuff. And it's been revealed recently that although they have taken an oppositional role to the government, it's been revealed that they actually have been receiving money from NGOs like National Endowment for Democracy, Open Society, what's the other, USAID, all these institutes, they have been receiving money from these institutions, and that all that money has gone into basically completely, organizing demonstrations that have no so-called political like angle to it. It's just anti-corruption, which is idealism. It's not, everything in capitalism is political. You don't exist outside the left-right spectrum, right? So that's been a really kind of contentious debate over there. But it's been purposely done because let's remember that after the coup in 2009 in Honduras, basically all the protests, it was a sea of red. People talking about socialism, radically transforming the country, etc. So the role of the NGOs, and this is part of the larger kind of the larger way that imperialism like changes its face and character, is the role of NGOs and these institutions in neutralizing and pacifying the masses, saying, no political flags, this is not about political parties, this is just like the people, and no real, like, not demanding any real substantial changes, because again, it boils down to they're scared of nationalization. They're scared of nationalizing the Social Security. They're scared of nationalizing all the agriculture. And part of that is because those countries are really the only colonies left that the U.S. has. It's like there's an expression is like Honduras and Guatemala are like the last gasps of air of U.S. imperialism, because El Salvador and Nicaragua are moving more in the direction of nationalization and trading more with China and Russia. Honduras and Guatemala are really all the U.S. has left. So rather than putting in, they've realized, okay, we can't put in the right wing, far right dictators like there are now. We can't do that. It doesn't work anymore. So what we're going to do is we're going to neutralize people. We're going to say, don't overthrow, just, peaceful protests, just no political colors. This is just, and basically robbing the people of their ability to organize and have a political position. So it's very sophisticated, and it's been done. It's happened a lot during the Arab Spring as well. It's happening. It's a new phenomena of imperialism, of like, it's like soft power, right? Rather than like putting in, a Pinochet, right, or Batista, they're putting in the softer, the Bernie Sanders people type, the softer people who are saying the things they want to hear, but aren't necessarily talking about radically transforming it. So that also teaches us how imperialism is changing in this era of like capitalism at a dead end, where now they're using more sophisticated ways, the NGOs, the social democrats, to hold back mass movements. If those NGOs wouldn't have infiltrated these movements now, I guarantee you overnight all of the industries would have been nationalized in Guatemala and Honduras, and all the U.S. companies would have been pushed out. But we see how that turns out. But, there's always potential, right? People have to learn from that and eventually realize that they need organization. So, thank you.